In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your rear wheel bearing and hub assembly on this Toyota Camry. If you need this or any other parts for your car, check us out at oneauto.com. Let's get started. Because this vehicle has a locking lug nut on the wheels, I'm going to break that free first by hand. That's this one right here. I do not recommend putting an impact of any kind on those locking lug nut keys. Having said that, I'm going to get the key, which should be with the vehicle, spin it until it lines up, press it on, use a 21mm socket and a long breaker bar to get some leverage. There we go, that broke free. Now I can leave it like this. You can use an impact to drive it out the rest of the way. You just don't want to break it free with one because the impacts from the impact can damage the splines on this little key. Now use a 21mm socket and your tool of choice to remove the rest of the lug nuts. With those off, remove the wheel. Now use a 14mm socket and remove both of these bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. If you wanted to take the caliper and the bracket off as an assembly, you're just going to have to use a 17mm socket, and I'll show you exactly where those bolts are in a second. But it does make things a little bit more complicated because you have the brake hose in the way. Sway bar link's going to be kind of in the way, so I like to just take this off first so that I can get better access to the bigger bolts. Once again, 14mm socket. Take this off and set it aside. Now we have these two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Let's break them free and remove them. There we go. Take this out. And take the second one out. And then you can remove the bracket with the pads. Now you should be able to remove the rotor. Mine is actually stuck on the hub here. You can see it's pretty rusty, so what I'm going to do is use a rubber mallet and tap it from the backside here where I remove the caliper. It gives me a nice access area where there's no backing shield. Okay, perfect. Now the only thing holding us up is going to be the parking brake shoes. Sometimes you can get the rotor off at this point, just slide it off, but sometimes they will hold you up. So let's pop this little grommet out. There we go. And now through this hole, we can access the adjuster, which I can't really show you now because it's inside of there and I can't really even see it myself, but I can show you it once we get the rotor off. The adjuster is going to look like a little star wheel, and you'll have to use a screwdriver or a little pry bar and spin it. Looks like I'm going the wrong way. For me, I have to spin it down. If I spin it up, it actually expands the shoes and catches onto the inside of the rotor even more. That's quite a few turns there, so that should be good. Yep, now we can remove the rotor. And with the rotor off, I can show you exactly what that looks like. This right here is that adjuster wheel that I was moving with my screwdriver. I was turning it downward in order to contract the shoes. Of course, for you, it may be different. You might have to spin it the other way, especially if you're on the other side of the vehicle. But spin it one way or the other to get the shoes closer together and allow them to let go of the rotor. I'm going to spray brake parts cleaner all over to get rid of most of the dust that's here. From the backside, you can see the four 14mm bolts that hold this wheel bearing on. We also have to unplug the ABS sensor, assuming your vehicle does have ABS. You're going to have to open this connector up just by prying open the little cover here. Remove this cover. Underneath it, you'll see the electrical connector. To unplug it, I'm just going to use some needle nose pliers. Very gently grab it like that. Press on that connector. Try not to damage the wires, of course. There it is. Now with a 14mm socket, let's remove all four bolts that hold this wheel bearing on. Does not matter where you start, just remove them all. For For this one, I'm going to use a wrench because the strut bolt here is preventing me from putting a ratchet on it. But once you break it free, you should be able to remove it by hand unless it's extremely rusty. As you remove these, do inspect them and make sure that they're still reusable. If they're rotted, replace them with factory grade bolts. At this point, you should be able to remove the wheel bearing. I'm going to hold on to the backing plate and the shoes, the brake shoes, because I don't want this whole thing to pop off, even though it most likely will, but I'm going to try really hard not to. Like I said, what usually happens is the whole thing comes off of the knuckle and then you have to hammer the wheel bearing out from the backside. If that happens, it is what it is. We'll do it if we have to, but if I can hold this on, that'd be great. Yep. Now, this is hanging by the parking brake cable, which is okay. I'm going to hold it by the shield. The parking brake cable is going to support it there. And with a hammer, I'm just going to tap the bearing until it pops out the other side. As at this point, it's just seized in the backing plate right here and the shield, so you just have to hammer it till it pops out. At this point, I'm actually going to grab a torch and heat this whole area up. If you don't have a torch, you're gonna have to keep hammering, but heat will help break this free. Try not to heat up things that shouldn't be heated up, such as the backing shield, the brakes, and now that this is exposed, try not to get that grease on fire. But at this point, you wanna heat up the backing plate so it can expand a little bit and let go of the hub. When you heat, try not to hit the brake cable either. Unfortunately, if that doesn't work, that's okay. I still have another backup plan, and that is to take the parking brake shoes off and take this entire assembly off so we can actually hit it with a hammer while it's mounted or sitting on something, or we could bring it over to the press and pop this out by pressing it out. So whatever it takes, hopefully you don't have to get to that step. But at this point, I guess, here's how you remove the e-brake shoes so we can continue with this procedure. I already put all 4 bolts just hand started back in there so that I can have this held on somewhat firmly. And well, let's continue. Let's remove the adjuster, take a screwdriver and pry the shoe out like that. That should allow you to get that adjuster popped off of there. There we go. Remove it, set it aside, and remember which direction it goes in with the threads facing towards the rear of the vehicle. That's how I took it off. Nothing bad will happen if you put it on backwards, but if you're used to spinning it one direction to loosen it and another to tighten it, it's good to put it back the same way. That way the next time you have to come in here, you don't get confused. Now let's remove the spring over here. You can either pry it out with something, screwdriver, pry bar, or you could just grab it with needle nose pliers here and move it out of the way. Now we have to remove the spring retainers here, holding the pin from the back side. You have to push in on the spring. As you can see, it pushes in like that. When you do this, you should be able to spin the pin so that it can go through the slot. Mine is a little bit rusty, so it's difficult to spin. If you need to, you can grab some needle nose pliers and spin it with that, but be very careful if you're reusing this hardware. Spinning it like this with pliers can actually break the head of it, and then you'll need new hardware because it won't lock in anymore. As soon as you line it up, it should slide through like that, which will release the shoe, so you can take the spring out, push your pin out the back, or you can leave it in here if you want. It does have a slot there that it can come out through. And up top here, we need to remove this blue spring. I mean, maybe it's not blue for you, but it's blue for me. And the way I'm gonna do this is with some needle nose locking pliers. I'm just gonna grab it and pull it up that way. Make sure your locking pliers are hanging on tight if you're using this method. Just like that. This fell, but this went on like this to separate the shoes, and then that spring went through this hole. So keep in mind which direction that goes and where it goes. Now we're left with the shoe, and all you have to do is just slide it off with this pin. This is your parking brake lever. So when you activate your parking brake, this is what pulls on the shoe. This is one shoe. Let's get the other side off. And here's that spring that we removed. Make sure that when you put it back, it goes back in the same area. And of course, I'm going to show you that, but just make sure you save them, because this is not going to be the same as the spring for the other shoe. Same deal on this side. It's just going to be a little bit easier because there's no parking brake lever. I'm going to start by popping this spring off. This one you can just twist out of there, remove the spring, and save it. If it's in good condition, of course. If it's not, you're going to want to replace them all. And there's your parking brake shoe. Now we have to do a couple things here with the parking brake shoes off. One is going to be to remove this lever, and to do this, all you need is to press in, and it should pop out as the spring collapses. We have to remove this 10mm bolt. A lot of times these are seized, and hopefully mine isn't. I'm going to try and work it back and forth with some rust penetrant that I've already sprayed in there. That feels promising, actually, so I can remove it the rest of the way. If yours breaks, it will break inside of the e-brake cable, and then you'll have to actually replace that cable or drill it out, re-tap it for a new bolt. So you want to try to avoid breaking it if possible. And I don't really recommend heating it, because you can actually melt the parking brake cable sheathing. So try to just remove it as gentle as you can. Now you can pull this through. Now remove your bolts that are holding the bearing and shield assembly on here. Take this out, and now we should be able to take this off and set it up either in the press or on the ground, however you have it set up, so we can get the bearing off this backing plate. So here's what I have set up. I have this giant rotor basically as a spacer, 2 blocks of metal holding the wheel hub and backing plate assembly, and they have a cutout so that they can kind of hug around the hub. And basically at this point I'm just going to heat this up again and hammer it down. But this is going to be a lot more secure because I have a sturdy surface to hammer against. Like I said, hopefully you don't need to get to this point, but it is what it is, so let's hammer it out. There it is. I wet this down just so that the dust wouldn't fly everywhere. And what I'm going to do now is clean out this bore where the hub mounts and just quickly clean off the rust that's building up along the surface here so that we can install the new hub nice and clean in here with no rust. And of course I will coat it with some anti-seize so that it doesn't continue to rust further. I'm going to use a sanding pad on this surface because the wire wheel is a little too soft, but I'm using a very soft sanding pad. I'm not removing material, I'm just removing the surface rust. So keep that in mind when you clean. Obviously you don't want to remove material off of the knuckle. Rinse it off with brake parts cleaner. And now I will apply some anti-seize. If you don't have that, you can use grease or whatever you have, but you do need to cover this area because it will rust, especially if you live in a rusty environment like this vehicle does. You don't want to leave bare metal exposed and you don't want to leave rust exposed because both of those will continue to rust. I have all the bolts through the knuckle so that as soon as I put this on, I can make sure it doesn't fall off. And I'm just going to put the bolts through. These obviously don't thread into the backing shield. So this will now stay on so we can put the wheel bearing on, start them, and clamp everything down back together. And then we can continue reassembling everything. Strongly recommend coating everything with anti-seize or whatever anti-corrosive coating you have, including the backside of this wheel bearing so that you don't run into this problem next time. This has to be replaced. Also, when you put this in, make sure the ABS connector goes through that hole, and as soon as you slide it in, you should be able to start in some of these bolts. The two top ones are going to be the easiest ones to start just because they're not recessed into the knuckle, and the two bottom ones, well, I'll just get those with a ratchet, a socket, and an extension in a second. But the more you can thread these on, the better of a chance you have of it holding on. So at this point, let's go on the back and thread them all in. Let's start the lower ones in. Looks like these are threading in nice and smooth, so that means they are lined up. That's great. That one's in, this one's in. So I'm gonna grab my ratchet, tighten them all up. I'm gonna tighten these in a cross pattern. That way this wheel bearing can squish the backing shield and seat into the knuckle evenly. If I just do one side at a time, it might put it at an angle, so I'm going to try to avoid that. This one here, I'm going to have to do with a wrench. The torque on all four of these is 44 foot-pounds. This one right here, I won't be able to get a torque wrench on just because of the clearance. So after I tighten these three, I will come back with a wrench and tighten this one. 44 foot-pounds is not a lot. I can definitely do that with a wrench with some decent leverage, and I'll just make sure it feels about as tight as the other ones. If you have a setup that can get in there, go ahead and use it. Just keep in mind that if you end up using a swivel, that's going to offset the torque reading. Okay, that should be nice and tight. Last thing we have to do on the back side here is plug in the ABS sensor, connect the connector, make sure that slides on and goes all the way down to make a good connection. And then there was this cover that covered up the connector as well as this part of the wire that's exposed. So try to put it back exactly the same way it was before. This cover had a couple tabs here, and the two wires that were not protected kind of loop through that and then go out through the side. And then you close it up kind of like a shell. There we go. Now you take your parking brake cable, put it through the back side of the backing plate, and try to get that bolt to line up. And with that snugged up, let's put back the end on this cable, or the arm, I should say. You can peel back the spring like that, hook the cable over, and let go of the spring. The spring really shouldn't be all that powerful. If you have to use pliers, you can use pliers. Just be gentle, not to damage the braided cable underneath. This is hooked on, so now we can put the e-brake shoes back together. Next, I want to apply some silicone paste or brake grease, if that's what you have, to the contact points or the contact areas where the shoes will sit. That way it avoids any sort of squeaking in the future when the parking brake is applied. Down here as well, this is where they contact the backing plate, and up here. And then of course we're gonna do the same on the adjuster on the bottom so that it doesn't squeak. At this point, if any of your hardware is too rusty to reuse, replace it. It is not good to put it back if it's not going to hold up, of course. Next, I'm going to put back the forward-facing shoe. And once you kind of situate it in place here, put the pin in through the back side, make sure it goes through. Then you take your spring and slide it over. Sometimes you can do this by hand. Sometimes you need a pry bar. But if you just press it, it should lock that shoe in place. Nice and tight like that. It keeps pushing down because this spring is pulling it. There was this spring, which sat in a little groove right up here. And then you're going to want to hook it up and over this piece right there. You can do this multiple ways: screwdriver, pry bar, locking pliers, whatever you have that will do the job. And you could even use a large pick if that's what you have. But this spring isn't too powerful, so you should be able to easily push it up and over. There we go. On this side, grease up your pivot point for the parking brake lever arm. We'll do the same thing. Put this shoe in, get the pin through the back side, and then lock it in with the spring. If you're going to use pliers to do that, be very gentle. You don't want to snap the end of the pin off. It's very possible that that could happen. At the top, this piece goes in where there is a cutout on each shoe, and it basically just holds these two a particular distance apart, just like that. And then to secure it, we have to put the spring over. So hook it in to the shoe, and then just like on the other side, we'll get in here and pry it over. Okay, the only thing is the end of this spring needs to get into this slot on that piece. So what I'm going to do is actually spread this shoe apart a little bit and get that in there. With that in there, we can put the shoe back. There we go. That spring is through. This piece is hooked in nice and tight. The only thing left is to put the adjuster and the spring on the bottom. Clean and lubricate your adjuster on all of the points that it moves on, and then put it back the same way you took it out. Same direction, that is. Nothing bad will happen if you put it back the other direction, except that if you're used to spinning it one way to adjust it, you're going to get a little confused next time you go to do this. And then take this lower spring, hook it over, just like that. Get that adjuster seated, and e-brake shoes are reattached. Let's put the rotor back on just to test it and make sure that the parking brake shoes are adjusted properly. I can just barely hear them touch. They're not dragging, they're not stopping the rotor, so that's actually a good thing, but they're also not so far that they won't even engage. So if you had to adjust it, you just use the adjuster, spin it out to expand the shoes and get it to be closer, or if they're too tight, too close to the head of the rotor, you would contract them or squeeze them together, and then that would let go, and you would have properly adjusted parking brake shoes. Now, before we finally put the rotor on, let's get some anti-seize on the surface of this hub so it doesn't rust, and then we'll continue with the installation. On here, you just want a thin layer that is going to coat this entire hub surface, especially right around this center part here. This is where the rotor will seize if it does end up rusting and seizing in place, and around the lug studs, of course. Try to avoid getting it on the threads of the lug studs because that'll throw off your wheel torque, but if you get a little bit of anti-seize on there, that's okay, but you don't want to coat the threads. That's my point. And you want just a thin layer on here, because if you put too much, it can actually start flinging out as you drive, and it'll actually get on the parking brake shoe surface where they're supposed to engage. So then when you go to engage your parking brake shoes, they will slide because they're greased up. So you want to avoid that. Just get a thin layer on here, just like so, enough to prevent corrosion. I'm using high temperature anti-seize for this. And now we can take that rotor and put it right back on, just like that. Perfect. Now let's get the caliper bracket with the pads back over the rotor, line it up, put in the 2 bolts, snug these up. The torque for both of these bolts is 58 foot-pounds. And 2. Now get the caliper over. Make sure it lines up with the slider pins. Get these bolts through, bottom them out, and then the torque for both of these is 20 foot-pounds. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. Once again, 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you go. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was helpful. If you have anything to say, leave it in the comments section below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can stay up to date with all of our latest content. Thanks for watching.